Hi, everyone. I'm back. Last time I was up here, 30 minutes later, the power on the entire campus went out, so I'm going to get off stage as quickly as possible, lest we have a repeat incident. Common thread here. My job to introduce Dr. Stephen Sloan. Dr. Sloan is a professor of history here at Baylor University. He's also the director of Baylor University's Institute for Oral History, and he happens to be also the executive director of the Oral History Association. So without further ado, I'm going to invite up Dr. Sloan to talk to us about oral history. And I'm going to hand out handouts, because that's what happens with handouts.
Yes, hand out the handouts. Thank you, Dan. Yeah, I heard the talk got so controversial this morning on issues that Baylor just shut down the whole power grid to try to choke off free speech and academic freedom. But congratulations for you guys sticking it out and not letting the man win once again. I'm happy to be with you. I'm a historian that uses oral history. I run an oral history program. I'm passing out some links for other resources, and if there's a way to deliver this to you electronically, I will. Is there a way for me to deliver this to you electronically? All right. Someday we'll have the tech where I could just think it, and it will appear in your mind as well, but thankfully we're not there yet. So we will distribute this to you. A few resources I want to point out there is the Baylor Institute for Oral History. So we have resources up there that you can use. We have a it's aimed at a student audience, Introduction to Oral History manual. It's about a 40-page little manual that you can download and use in your classes free of charge if you would like. We also do 2 basic workshops every year online, a 6-hour training in oral history methodology that will kind of take you through everything like transcription and all the parts of oral history that I'm not going to, of course, get into today. We also do an advanced, if you're an experienced oral historian, we also do an advanced workshop every year. Next year it's going to be on remote oral history. We have always done we've done online workshops since 2009. And in early COVID, we got a lot of inquiries from oral historians that want to keep their projects going. So we did a oral history at a distance workshop that had 600 participants, like international participants. And so we decided to write a book. So this is what oral historians do. We write things down, which really ruins it. I believe it ruins it when you write it down. And so we've got a book coming out next year on called Oral History at a Distance. It is looking at remote practice, so that could be a possibility for some of your classes. I just finished writing the chapter on interviewing, and I thought about the things we've all thought about virtual interactions and how that changes social interaction when we're on virtually. All sorts of interesting stuff, like why you look at yourself on Zoom instead of looking at the person that you're supposed to be. Okay, see, a collective chuckle, because you all do that. You do that because you've never seen yourself that way before, and you are endlessly fascinated, it seems, with how you look. I mean, are endlessly terrified with how you look on that. And so it's a very different thing in oral history and remote practice to engage with yourself during an oral history interview, not something we did when we were in a face-to-face setting back in the day. So today, what we're going to do, I'm going to talk just a little bit about oral history. I'm going to give you my sales pitch. Those skeptics who are eager to get off Baylor's campus, I'm the last thing that you've got to put up with today. I'm going to give you a little bit of a sales pitch on why I think oral history could be useful in your classroom. I'm going to acknowledge some of the obstacles I know that many of you are facing at doing something like that. And then I'm going to make some simple suggestions on projects. And then Amy, stand up and take a bow. Yes. PhD candidate Amy Achenbach helped this bibliography that you see that you see in front of you that has other resources, more to look at there. We underpay GA labor at Baylor just like everyone does. And so we're very grateful for her effort in doing this. You can put this down as a publication. And I had someone else look at it, so it's peer reviewed. So, so congratulations. So put that down. And we're going to end, I'm going to give you some suggestions on levels of oral history use in the classroom, and there's some great examples in those projects to take it further if you want to learn more. Tomorrow morning, we're going to have a breakout where I'm going to do a bit of training. I'm a bit of a train the trainer sort of thing to introduce you to training someone to do oral history work, and then perhaps you'll use that and go out and evangelize. Again, a Baylor reference. Sorry, not anyone laughed at that. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about how oral history can be used in the classroom, and there's several things I thought about in thinking about the ways in which oral history can be really useful in the classroom. And I wanted to connect to maybe some things that you're already doing. One thing is, most of us as history teachers know the power of biography, using biography in the classroom. If you use, even as a historian, there's something about biography that crystallizes a topic in a way that makes it accessible and relatable. And I've often used biography in the classroom as a way to get students to kind of engage with subject matter in a way that's not completely abstract and loose, but the way in which one individual will live through an event, thinking about that with biography. We cover, oftentimes invariably, many of you are trying to cover so much ground, so much chronological ground in teaching. And biography becomes these moments where you can kind of crystallize it down to the human experience of some of these things that we're talking about. And sometimes that's very hard to do in the abstract. Well, it's an easy leap to think of the ways that oral history can do that as well for you. And talking about the recent past, which is what we're dealing with primarily with oral history, we're dealing within the living memory of whatever topic we're dealing with. But it's a way to kind of crystallize what can be a very diffuse, large topic down into the experience of one life lived, or one community, or one family living through history. It's important, I got ahead of myself, it's important to define what oral history is. My mother still does not understand what oral history is. She says things like, I want to come down and see the Oral History Museum. I was like, Mom, there's not an Oral History Museum. There's some undergrads, chained to a desk transcribing things, and then my office and some other faculty. If we think about oral history, I'm going to give you some simple things that oral history is. Oral history is first person. So we are treating topics, we're interviewing people that have first person experience of events. So these are not, and that's really important, right? We want our students engaging with someone who experienced phenomenon, and that can be a wide range of topics connected to that. One way I'll give you a caution now, one thing that we don't like as oral historians is what's called salvage oral history, which means when you hit 80, you get interviewed, or you hit 90, you get interviewed. Not a very strategic way to organize an oral history project, right? We need to think intentionally with our project design on who needs to be interviewed and why do they need to be interviewed around whatever topic that we're dealing with. And I'm not going to get into project design, but you think creatively around that topic about who needs to be interviewed. There's a famous project that was done on a Baltimore neighborhood among oral historians, and they realized after this big project was done, they didn't interview anybody that left the neighborhood. They didn't interview anybody across the street. So there were all these angles toward that neighborhood that they missed in their original project design. So that first person, how do we gather a variety of perspectives around an event? An object lesson I use with that my wife hates is my mother-in-law has this horrendous centerpiece on the table at their house. I mean, it is a horrible, I wish I had a photo of it. It is a horrible centerpiece. It's one of those centerpieces that if you would like to eat at the table, you have to grab a friend and collectively move the centerpiece so you can sit down and eat at the table. But I always joke that, that table, that centerpiece, it's a little bit like designing an oral history project. If I'm going to figure out what this thing is, I mean, it's got horns in it, it's got gourds in it, it's got a little baby's breath, and I think there's some moss. I don't know if it's original or it's something that's accumulated on the centerpiece. But if I'm gonna understand what this thing is, I need somebody with a different perspective, somebody with a different vantage point on this thing to begin to describe to me what they see, somebody from a different vantage point to describe to me what they see. And if we can get enough angles on this thing around the table, sometimes we're trying to do this with our source material already in class, right? To have a variety of perspectives around a topic. If we all work together, we know the historical record is not neutral. There are the voices that are absent. There are the voices that are loud and dominant. How do we address that in some of the ways in which we introduce sources to our students? That first-person experience of those that are usually missing is one way to do that. So oral history is first person. It's guided. It is a guided exercise. This is the training part that I end up doing a lot is what makes a good oral history interviewer. It is a research exercise, research objectives that you are pursuing in that interview. How do you do it well? We don't just turn on recorders and hope something good happens, because it usually won't. It's something very intentional, and so that practice is a big part of oral history. So it is first person, it is guided, it is recorded. Okay, so oral history as a methodology grew up with technology. So it started on wire recorders, back in the 30s and 40s, that first wave of oral historians, even those combat historians that were interviewing soldiers in after-action oral histories. They're using wire recorders to record those oral histories. It grew up with reel-to-reel recorders. It expanded with cassettes. I started my career on cassettes. I tell people like Amy that I started my career on cassettes. That's like, what? This is, that might as well be bloodletting or, some sort of, they're drilling holes in people's heads. That seems like radically old technology. But cassettes were actually a great platform, but I won't go into that. A great platform. And then, of course, now we've moved to the digital age. And so oral history as an approach has continued to rethink itself because the tech has changed, right? And then there's, of course, DH projects. Oral history connect well with DH projects because we were multimedia before multimedia was cool. We've been collecting audio and video for a long time, and so it translated very well to the digital age. But how do you record? That recorded part of oral history, how do you do it well is a big question. Do you do it with audio or video? And that's a choice, and that says something. That's a decision you have to make. Most instructors would say to me, well, you have the ability to do video, why wouldn't you do video? But there's all sorts of challenges with video that come in. First off, they're going to want to use their phone. That's not a great idea, to use a phone to record something. Because the last thing oral history is it's preserved. We take steps to preserve the recordings that are made. It is a great courtesy that our narrators extend to us in agreeing to do an oral history interview, and we want to steward that courtesy really well. So we have about 8,000 interviews in our collection here at Baylor. Those were done for a variety of different purposes, but as you might imagine, in fact, I was talking to Don about a mutual friend who passed. Her voice is captured at Baylor, and it is in that collection forever. So, it was recorded for one purpose, to try to understand the African-American experience in Waco, but it will live on as a very important piece of that family's history and that community's history. because we will preserve her voice and her transcript from here on out. So taking steps towards preservation, and I'm sure you're saying, what am I going to do with it? I know, I'll put it on YouTube. That'll solve it. Again, not a preservation solution. So one of the things that oral history is going to challenge you to do as an instructor is to collaborate. Okay, first off, you're going to be collaborating with a narrator or an interviewee. We call them narrators often. But it's also a great opportunity to collaborate with others on campus, to work with others on campus. When I teach my graduate seminar oral history, which, you know, what a waste of money, Amy, because you could have come to a 40-minute presentation and gotten, I mean, you should apologize to someone. When I teach that class, you know, that is a big issue, this choice of where are we going to preserve it and how are we going to preserve it, and make that collaboration connection really well is really important. But when I teach that grad class, when I last taught it, there were 7 different disciplines represented in the class. So there are other people that are interested in oral history besides just historians. Journalism, curriculum instruction, religion, music, museum studies. There's a lot of people that can understand the worth. Wherever I go on campus, I hear people talking about gathering stories or doing deep qualitative research, which is really what we're doing with oral history. So we keep those definitional things in mind that I said, and there can be ways we provide for all those as we go forward. But that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about oral history. Other reasons why I think using oral history in your classroom could be beneficial is it makes history personal in a lot of ways for your students. Now, we're all from Texas, so we'll ask the question before I'll connect us as Texans. And whether you came from somewhere else, this is where your paycheck is, so sorry, you're a Texan. Now, that's, you know, we're all in this together. When you tell someone what you do for a living, my wife is a psychologist, and so, you know, when we go to a dinner party or something, and she tells someone what she does for a living, they re-examine everything they've said so far. And that it's like a pastor, right? You know, well, maybe that joke wasn't a great idea now that I know what you do for a living. But when you tell someone you teach history, what is their response? Cool, I'm a history buff. Okay, you're hanging out in certain circles, obviously. What? It was my worst subject. It's so boring. Okay, yeah. Yeah, their eyes roll in the back of their head, okay, and they're not going to chew their arm off to get away from you, but they may make their way there. It all depends on that teacher, right? I mean, it seems like it all goes back to that teacher that connected something for them at some point in a classroom or in a semester somewhere. In Texas, sometimes we have a little bit of a disadvantage. I'm not saying coach can't teach history well. But you know, generally we got to give coach something to do during the day. Why not let them teach history? Sometimes they make wonderful connections for that student. But I'm going to say that personalization angle that comes with oral history is one of the things that I think can make it really meaningful as an approach in a classroom. If they have a personal encounter with someone that has lived through and experienced the history that they may be talking about abstractly in the classroom, it's hard for them to maybe hold it as much of a distance as they could normally hold it, because it encountered the life of someone that they now have a relationship with. I think it's a great opportunity also to teach them about primary sources, which is something that we're all trying to do. We're trying to cover all that content, right? But we also want to expose them to what it means to be a historian, okay? It allows them to not only encounter primary sources in a new way, but create a primary source. I have people contact me all the time and talk about their interview that's in the archive that they did back in the 70s or back in the 80s or back in the 90s. And it's such a meaningful piece of their education, which may just exist on a transcript at Baylor besides that, but it also exists in that archival piece that they created. Not only to create a primary source, but for them to have a relationship with the primary source and this sort of exchange back and forth. Not only can they interrogate a primary source, they can re-interrogate. Maybe interrogate is not the right word to use. But they can have this conversation and this relationship. One of the favorite things I've seen happen in the classroom setting is oftentimes instructors will do maybe an end of the semester event where they'll bring in some narrators that students worked with during the semester. And it's a wonderful experience to see these relationships that form, often intergenerational relationships that form between students and community members, organization members, whatever topic we may be choosing to work on. And it's a real neat thing to see, because I think about what I'm teaching students at time. I'm teaching them historic methodology, but I'm also teaching them how to listen. I'm also teaching them how to edit. I'm also teaching them how to do research. How do you design a good research question? What does that mean, and what does it look like? And also, perhaps empowering them a bit. If they see silences in the world, how are they going to address that silence? Is there something you could do, someone you could talk to, someone that has not been heard, that could be heard using oral history? And so that personalization aspect of it and that primary source work is another reason why I really like it. The last reason I would say is community engagement. So this is something that is becoming vogue now. Maybe not in your tenure guidelines, but in the world in general, it's becoming vogue. This idea of what is the responsibility of the local educational institution? Does it have a responsibility to the broader community? Oral history is a way to get at that engagement. It is a methodology to get at that engagement, because I think, as Maria said earlier, there are history buffs out there, right? History is something the general public, especially in Texas, is invested in. How many historical markers do we have in Texas? Anybody got a rough guess? It is over 15,000 now historical markers. Canada has 4,000. So it's unbelievable the ways in which history is all around us, but we're also, particularly with history, I would say, we're bad about this. Sometimes we're very detached from our local history and our community history, right? It would be a shame, I think, if a student went through my class and thinks about history as something that happened somewhere else. History is not something that happened in this community. It's a set of people and a set of issues and a set of problems that occurred somewhere else. It really changes how we think about this place. I like to think of the creative way as approach to think all history is local history. And so how do we localize some of the things that we're teaching? And even in those resources that Amy selected and laid out for you, we can talk about some really complex things through oral history. We can talk about globalism. We can talk about immigration. We can talk about capitalism. We can talk about whatever you want to talk about. There's a way to get at that. I'm from a small town. Even from the small town I'm from, there's a way in which that touches that town. And I would say thinking creatively about a way to make that connection is a huge part of community engagement. There are also institutions, groups within the community that are equally enthusiastic about you doing this project, perhaps even more enthusiastic about you doing this project, because they realize the ways in which their own history is slipping through their fingers. So this is an expertise that we can take to them to help them organize a project that's going to be a lot of value to them. Okay, and of course, in the back of your mind, you're continuing to think, Sloan, what a lot of work. This all sounds like a lot of work. The community partner, the right community partner, can lift a ton of that burden off of you. Okay, if they have their enthusiasm for the project, they can bring along identifying interviewees, helping set up interviews, facilitating the process for you at the community level. Okay, and so you can think. We don't have time for you to sit and think in quiet here, unless the lights go out. But I mean, I want you to kind of begin thinking about, okay, we've got your syllabus over here, and I've got my community over here. What are the ways in which I can make connection from here to there? Okay, because that community engagement, I would say, my institution has a whole administrative glut in that area, so it must be important to them. Look where they put administrative glut. But this idea, it's important to your institution. It's important to most of your institutions. Okay, so figuring out a way to engage the community, tear down the town gown sort of separation that we have. Oral history is a very accessible methodology to begin to do that. Even on a small scale, I would say it has power in doing that. Some of your institutions are members of Campus Compact, which is an organization that tries to facilitate these sort of connections. And there's been survey after survey that shows you as faculty think it's important for the place that you're working to have a connection to the place where it's located. And so community engagement is a real power there. And again, this is not just about doing something nice for the community. This is about giving another tool to your students, but it's also about giving another resource to the community. And there's mutual benefit that can come from organizing a project like this. Okay, here's all the things that you're thinking in your head that you're going to say. Some of you discounted me in the first 5 minutes, and you've been planning dinner since then. It takes time and energy to create courses and programs that engage the community well. So one of the reasons why those resources are there are things that you can drag and drop. There's things that you can kind of pull over and drop into a course, even to begin at a very light level. I'm going to give you some suggestions on how to layer this here in a minute. I think there's small ways in which you can introduce it. I would caution you about this, to have overly grand designs on introducing this into the classroom. I oftentimes have talked people off. I was in the University of Southern Mississippi before I came back to Texas, and I had a journalism professor I collaborated with, and when Katrina happened, he wanted to go down to the coast and hand out 1,000 recorders. So I did not allow him to go down and hand out 1,000 recorders. I said, let's do one interview, and then if that goes well, let's do 2 interviews, and then we'll do 3, and then we'll go from there. And so I would say starting small and having a proof of concept here is a great idea, particularly if you're introducing it to your institution. Because just like my mother, your administrator is not going to necessarily know what oral history is. So we need to have a proof of concept. I'll tell you, since it's just us, I'll tell you, and this isn't being recorded. It is being recorded. One of the things that I would encourage you to do, if you haven't done this, is to start with your institution. Start with your institution to do some oral history on your institution. I think Dr. Livingstone talked this morning about Baylor's recent process of, okay, so, you know, there are questions and people that need to be interviewed at your institution. Starting there with a small project is a great place to start. I try to convince my grad students to do oral history in their family. You know, start where you are, start where your connections are, those barriers to access drop. We'll talk about this in the morning, but there's insider outsider dynamics we think about in interviews that you'll have to address with a project like that. But that's a great place to start, particularly if I'm trying to sell an administrator on the project. Because who would an administrator think is the most important person to be interviewed? Themselves, yeah. So this methodology is so important you're being interviewed. So it also, a barrier here is it's messy. Oh man, it can be messy, right? I mean, we're going to go out and do what? With people where? And it's outside that door and out of my line of sight. We're going to do this. So it is much messier a methodology. It's going to require you maybe holding your expertise a little bit loosely. It's going to bring some complexity into some conversations in the classroom. I love it when a student goes out with an idea of what they think history is and they come back befuddled. And they find out, well, that's not the experience Mrs. Jones had with this. It provides an opportunity to begin to talk about the complexity of history in a real way. I remember a project a student did when I was in Mississippi that went to an African American community and heard how bad the civil rights movement was. Church membership declined, the bank left the neighborhood, they lost the grocery store. That was her experience of the civil rights movement. I had other sources, of course, that talked about the accomplishments and the gains of the civil rights movement, but her lived experience of the civil rights movement conflicted. You know, she talked about what happened to the school and what happened to the leaders of the school. It conflicted that story for the classroom, and it introduced some really important things to talk about that I felt like were really useful. And again, is it an instructor throwing that in the middle of the room to talk about, or is it someone who lived this experience introducing it in the classroom? It can be very powerful in that regard. How do you evaluate it? How do you reward it? That goes back to the tenure and promotion thing. Sometimes this is a barrier. For some of you, that's a very real barrier. They may want to wedge this into service. When I went up for tenure, I had a very bloated service category. I've never heard of anybody getting tenure with service, but surely it's out there. Something, research, teaching stinks. But man, that guy could serve on a committee like no one. Let's give him a permanent contract. Okay, I've never heard of that happening. But again, what's nice about now versus when I started 20 years ago is there are resources out there that are talking about the value of this. So institutions are ahead of perhaps your institution that understand the value of having another model. Even the AHA, there's a vibrant conversation within the AHA of saying, well, maybe it's not just journal articles and monographs. Maybe something else could be productive historical output. Okay, there are resources now to help you make that argument. And I also know at your institution, like my institution, there may be structural boundaries that make this challenging to do. I realize that. We're gonna send students into people's homes. Okay, what does that look like? Okay, we're going to ask students to drive somewhere to do something. So there are things that you're going to have to navigate, I acknowledge, but I will tell you there's models out there that we can use, and if we're creative, we have a community partner, we can pick a neutral space, we can do other things to navigate some of these challenges. And so I realize the barriers here. I'm just asking you to try it, and then I'm going to jack up the price. Yeah, some of you are tired. So I'm going to give you some ideas just quickly, and then I'm going to have a little time if you've got questions, which you won't, because no student has questions at the end of class, because that answer is between them and leaving class. I was joking with someone the other day about being a history professor. Oh, I had my joke. I didn't. You know how many historians it takes to screw in a light bulb? No, STEM has all the light bulbs. But anyway, this is the only room that would get even a half-hearted courtesy laugh in. Okay.
It doesn't matter. STEM has all of those. Okay. I threw myself off. Anyway. But it was my joke. And that's an original. So, it's not out there. Don't go looking for it. And if you do share it, just trademark. TM. Okay. Levels of design for oral history project that I want to suggest you to kind of think about. Okay. The first is just incorporate oral sources. Perhaps in your classroom, just decide on introducing oral sources in your classroom and talk about what it means to use an oral source. Okay? Now, you all, like my people, have a textual fetish. Historians are bad about this. We like text, and we see magic in text that we don't see in oral sources. Somewhere we were blinded somewhere along the way. But just the idea of introducing oral sources in the classroom and talking about what does it mean to use an oral source. Another level, if we want to do something a little more intensive than that, how about we do a in-class interview? So we bring a narrator into class. We spend some time before that session talking about what makes a good question. What would be the things that we would really want to understand here? How would you get at that in asking a certain set of questions? How do you listen? Sometimes one of the most valuable things I'm teaching students is practice listening. Because I will tell you, most time you're not listening. Even you guys, even you learned. It's learned. Even you learned. No, I'm just kidding. I know it's learned. Even you educated people in the room, you're not actively listening during conversation. You're passively listening. And you're listening for a topic that's related to some topic you might have, and then you jump in with your story about it. So actively listening, which is something I'm trying to teach students, is not just listening topically, it's listening for meaning and significance, or listening to not only what is shared, but what is not shared, or how what is shared is shared. And those are really interesting things to analyze. But yeah, the wife likes that I practice active listening at work, because then I can come home and pretend I'm actively listening to her. The game's on, but behind her, yeah. So, that listening, I think, sometimes I think of the ways oral history is a bit countercultural. I think that's one aspect that's really countercultural. What does it mean to really sit and listen in long form? I mean, our interviews are generally, the average length of interview in our big collection is an hour and a half. Okay, spending time with someone to truly, and I think understanding is a long form exercise. So really spending time with a narrator to try to understand. So we could work together as a class, and then the narrator comes in and talks to us, and then we can analyze afterwards what made a good question. How did they respond to this? What do you think about this? Is the position they presented conflict? Anything that maybe we've learned in our other sources? What are the ways it's in agreement? What are the ways it's presenting a counter-narrative? And oral history is great at presenting a counter-narrative also, okay, if you like those. The next step might be a family oral history, having your students go home. Some of you have heard StoryCorps before, which on NPR, which is I heard it best described as a media project with oral history elements, which an oral historian must have come up with that definition, but they've tried to facilitate this National Day of Listening the day after Thanksgiving, which is usually the day you're fighting over a doll or a big screen TV, so I don't know that it's going to get traction. But just that idea of doing a family oral history project where you put it to the students to try to make a connection with something you're doing in class, and they go home and they record their interviews. Anytime I do an oral history interview, I'm trying to keep three things in mind. It has a project value, right? There's a research value. I'm trying to answer some questions. There's something I'm trying to get at in this interview. It also has a private value. Again, Sometimes the testament I record is the only testament of the person that I've recorded. Okay, people don't write memoirs anymore. Even if they do, a memoir is not what I'm doing. You know, I'm exploring their experience. I'm not just documenting their experience with a research aim in mind. And it also has a public value. Okay. Did you notice that? There's something similar about all those. It has a project value, a public value. Yeah, because this is a Baptist institution. Any good sermon you've ever heard, they all have to start with the same letter. Okay, so if it starts S, sin's going to be in there somewhere. You can bank on it. But yeah, so project value, or private value, and public value, and balancing all those is something, right? I mean, that's something very different to do in your research. Oftentimes, historian, we think about the project value, and then it kind of stops there. There's some other considerations to bring into play here as well. So it could be a family oral history. They could do that. Most of the time, I'm training anyone to do oral history. I encourage them to work within a life history framework. So we do not follow a journalistic approach. You know, how did you feel when your house burned down? Bad, okay? Historians want context, right? So I want to know about that house, living in that house, what it was like living in the house. We gather context, and we gather context often by doing life history. And so we get very rich narratives of life history in doing an oral history approach. Family oral history was on one level. The next level is choose your own project. Okay, we design a project that I love it when we can connect it to some sort of thesis project they've got to do or some sort of community service effort they've got to do. If we can hook those things together, that's wonderful. It's a flexible methodology. What question do you want answered? What questions do you want answered as you leave here to have answered and written? So they could choose their own project. And then the last one would be designing a common project together. One of the challenges, a real challenge, and you'll find this out, some of you may be experienced oral historians, I don't know, but one of the challenges you will find is the semester construct, right? So there's this artificial thing that we have laid over how we do work, and then it changes. So for some of you, a common project, we could execute it together, but you may be the thread if that project goes from semester to year to year. Okay, you may be the thread, the constant. You know, as the interviewers change or the project members change, you may be the constant. Because sometimes, as you might imagine, particularly in communities in which you're an outsider, or particularly in communities that may have a conflicted relationship with your institution, it takes time to build trust in what you're doing and to develop that sort of access. Can take time. Okay, there's going to be times at which you have not explained your purposes well, and there'll be random students in their house with a recorder. Okay, you know, we've got to explain our purposes well and think long term about what we want to accomplish. And so I know that many of you say, hey, well, this is all too much. And that last one may be. I would encourage you just to kind of begin to explore the role oral history might have in your pedagogy. Look at examples. I've put my email there. I'm happy to help in any way that I can. You can look at our resources at the Institute for Oral History. I'm also director of the Oral History Association that has resources, but we also have a Texas Oral History Association. When we secede, that'll be the National Oral History Association. But so there's a Texas Oral History Association that has a conference, and we love stuff that you've done in your classroom, bringing students so they can have a conference experience, even at the undergraduate level, to bring students to present work at the Texas Oral History Association conference. We were in San Marcos in September. Too many hills in San Marcos. They should have leveled that thing out before they built Texas State. But anyway, I've got just a minute. If anybody's got questions, I will tease my training in the morning. You're welcome to come to that. I don't know what's up against me, but it can't be very good. I'm just kidding, Julia. Go to Julie's session. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and I would think through that. Oftentimes, I give an alternative. You know, I can say, you know, we could pursue a family history project, or we also have an ongoing kind of institutional history project that you could choose to pursue. Because you're right. I mean, there's things that they could be stepping into in a family project that would make it more difficult. But it's always nice to have some sort of alternative for them to pursue. So, yes, ma'am. Yes. That is a great question. So I'd like to do 15 minutes on IRBs. Just stick with me. This will be fun. No. So the good news is oral history is exempt from IRB review. So you may need to show those resources to your little fiefdom IRB that, you know, but it is exempt, and the Department of Health and Human Services has clarified that exemption over and over again. So you do not have to do IRB review. Yes, ma'am. It is a clarification that has come down from the federal government that set the common rule back in the 70s to protect human subjects research. They finally clarified that they weren't talking about oral history. They were talking about medical research with human subjects and things like that. But I will say, yes, your IRB at your institution, you're going to have to lead them to those resources. They're not going to know that it's exempt, but it's out there, and I can share it with you if you need it. Yeah. Yeah, with oral history, you should not have to anymore. There's plenty of evidence and argument to not do it. Yes, sir. I have, yes. And what's nice about oral history in that regard is there's all sorts of outcomes. You know, you can mention, I've done theatrical productions, podcasts, radio, video documentary, curriculum. I have an app that I do. So there's a lot of different outcomes that you could have with oral history. It's very flexible in that regard. Once we have the media, you can just think there's a host of different things. Soundscapes, there's a host of different things that we can do with it. All right, one more question, and then I'll hang around. All right, well, I will hang around if you've got any additional questions. Thank y'all so much for having me.